Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Odell. Welcome to the Master Series, where we talk about things related to counseling, Christianity, and culture, and everything in between. I have with me today as my colleague, Laura Rhodes. Laura has a Master's of Divinity and a lot of education and experience besides. And we're going to be talking about a topic today that maybe hits a little bit closer to home for people than is comfortable. We're talking about grief, and um, grief is a very complex, very difficult, and I was going to say emotional experience, but that's not broad enough. It's bigger than that. Um, and knowing you a little bit personally, you've had some pretty powerful acquaintance with grief over the years, and in a way, I would say you're an expert experientially far more than most people would ever be academically. And so that's why um, I'm really looking forward to you sharing the wisdom that you have um, that has been gained through some pretty interesting challenges. We live in a society that really doesn't like suffering, wants to eliminate it, and believes it should be eliminatable, if that's a word. We're kind of a death denying culture, even though we have this strange, almost schizophrenic relationship with death because, we have all this movement toward euthanasia and we can talk about abortion. But when it comes to unwanted death, if they're, I guess you could put it that way,
Sure.
or unwanted suffering, we would just like to try to ignore it or make it go away or eliminate it or something.
By all means, a quick fix if it is going to happen.
A quick fix.
Mm-hmm.
We are not a patient people. And grief is not something that lends itself to impatience. Okay. I was thinking about grief conceptually. Um, we think about it sometimes as an emotion, but I don't think it's just one. I actually think it's a conglomeration of emotions that have a number of ingredients in them in varying proportions. So some grief, one of the first things that comes to mind is the death of a loved one. That is a very major grief, and depending on that, whether that was something that was foreseen, you have a 90-year-old. That might not be the same as a 12-year-old. In fact, it won't be the same as a 12-year-old. But there are also different kinds of grief. The loss of a job is different than the death of a loved one. A life-changing tragedy. Johnny Erickson Tata, who paralyzed from the neck down at the age of 17 from a diving accident, and every day, every moment, she has to be aware of that change. So grief is really a complex of emotions in various ingredients, if you will. And I'm just going to throw out some emotions I think that are in that mix, and I am sure that you have a pretty large lexicon yourself that can weigh in. But one of the first things that people notice, and that sounds like, oh, I'm noticing something, and no, it's not that. It's like blam. But one of the things that one of the emotions that's pervasive is sadness. A very powerful sense of loss. A
I think that gets at the heart of it is because it's loss. All of it's loss. And so it's the loss of her arms and legs. It's the loss of a loved one. It's sometimes the loss of relationship that you thought you were, something went wrong, or,
Divorce.
exactly. I think that's a matter of grief as well.
That
Yeah.
also could have relief in it. And
Oh,
that's one of the weird things about grief, because there are circumstances where relief is a part of the process, and then sometimes that just like piggybacks guilt.
I was going to say, yeah, guilt.
Right. So, my 90-year-old father has passed away, and it's been a long, hard road for 15 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And, it's almost somehow wrong to say, and not cliched, he's in a better place. No, but it's almost wrong to say, I'm glad it's over. I'm
Right.
glad that he is gone. He is no longer experiencing the suffering, but neither are we, maybe. And then it's like, how can you say that and be okay?
Yeah.
So, but you got this pervasive sadness, this sense of loss, and to your point, it's not coming back. It's not like, well, just wait till next year. It's darn, we got knocked out of the playoffs in the first round, but
It'll come back. Yeah.
next year we'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
It isn't coming back. And I think, again, that is not something that in 21st century America we are really able to settle well with. Other emotions that come to mind
Anger.
in grief.
For sure.
Oh, yes.
For
Yes.
sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And anger brings with it a certain energy. So you've
Almost
got this
an
loss,
empowerment.
you've got loss, and then the sadness, and then this realization that you have to craft a new normal, and then the anger of, wow, that the situation, especially if it was an accident or something spontaneous, that it was like, wow.
And anger tends to need to have a target. So, suicide. That's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
So sometimes that anger is at the person who's suicided, and then, and that may be a conversation for another time. But there is even a piece of that where it's like, well, they did choose to do this thing, and yeah. So that anger maybe has a legitimacy there in that target, but other kinds of grief, I'm mad at the swimming pool that I dove into, and then we get litigious. Anger can be
Yes.
empowering. So we're going to sue everybody
Doctor
who ever,
or,
right? The doctor and the concrete worker and the owner of the property and all that, because there is this almost this unwillingness to let this thing be as powerless as it makes me. But I do think, again, powerlessness is another major feature of grief. There's nothing I can do about it
right.
except go through it.
Yep. Because you
Endure
can't bring
it.
the person back.
Right.
Or the situation, you can't rectify it.
Right.
It's a loss.
Mostly, I guess you could get remarried to the person you divorced,
Yeah.
but for the most part, let's just say that grief is unlikely to be reversed or recovered, because that thing that has been lost is not going to come back.
Yeah.
So anger can be empowering. It oftentimes needs a target. Sometimes that's helpful. Sometimes it's really not helpful, though.
It's distracting.
Uh-huh.
So you're not doing that hard work that says, let me come to grips with this. Let me somehow craft a new normal.
Wait.
Let me.
What? Work? What?
Yeah.
There's work?
There's a lot of work.
Okay. We're going to want to take a much deeper look at that here in just a little bit. But again, for a person who's in the process of grieving, or they're in the process of being alongside someone who is grieving, I think it's important for them to be able to appreciate the range of emotions that are all attached to this, that are just there, that to the person who's not maybe experiencing it firsthand doesn't make sense. Why do you feel hopeless? Your life hasn't
Yeah,
ended,
you're fine.
something like that. Why do you feel rootless? We were talking a little bit a while ago about when both of your parents leave this world and you're officially an orphan,
Yes.
even if you're 40 or 60 years old or whatever. That's truly different.
Yeah, with that, there's this loss of story. So when you think, what was the name of that school that I went to in the first grade? Oh, it starts with a B, and it's like, oh, I can't ask
I
anyone
can't
that.
just call right
No
up and
one,
say, right.
no one knows. It doesn't matter, I guess. But yeah,
So in a sense, one's history starts to
part of your
feel like
story.
it like begins to evaporate, or darn, I wish I'd have written that down, or
Yeah,
you know, so and
yeah.
so would, yeah, so and so's not here to ask.
And with that comes a part of sort of losing the fact that you were known by the person that you lost. So you lose that connection and that the fact that you were known, which can lead to that rootlessness
Yeah,
feeling. It's like, oh, that person that really knew me is now that person. All those inside jokes or whatever, it's just
right.
gone.
And that's another feature. That's a great point. There's another feature of grief that, in a way, feels positive, but it hurts. There's a wistfulness that, remembering the times way back, and oh, they were
Yeah,
so good, and we're never going to have that again. But they were
I
so
know.
good, and I wish I could share this moment,
Yeah,
with them
which I
with
have
them again.
seen the flip side of that with where the person almost becomes sainted in that wistfulness.
Mm,
So the memory of that person is now probably a little bit better than that person was because it's the remembering the positive. You're
yes,
focusing
right,
on what you lost, not the irritants that were also maybe
right,
removed in the relationship or something like that.
right. There is sometimes a pull to sanitize the person. If we're talking about a person who's been lost,
Yeah,
there is some of that. I don't think that's actually very helpful. It may be helpful, like in the immediacy of it,
it's hard for the people left behind because they'll never lived up to that sainted person's
right,
image because they're real
right.
people.
Or
Yeah.
if the person who's been lost has a different relationship with the other members
Yeah.
of that group, and so the person who's saying, oh, so and so was such a great person, and the other person's going, oh, no, they weren't.
Yeah. You're
Maybe
remembering.
they were to you,
Yeah.
but they weren't to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, there's this real maelstrom of complexity in
Yeah.
this. Let's see, what other emotions might there be? Paralysis.
Mm-hmm.
How do I go on? What do I
Yeah.
do next?
Yeah. I think that gets compounded with depression
Mm,
because depression kind of brings its own brand of paralysis where you're just like, oh, I'm not even sure what step to take next, and you're just sort of sitting it.
you've already touched on this a little bit, but part of that um, paralysis also has that effect of messing up one's sense of self. There's identity
Yeah.
disturbance
Mm-hmm.
that who
Who
am
am
I
I?
now that this is no longer the case, and you're also bringing up depression, that's a really good point, because in the mental health world there has been this difficulty figuring out what to do
Mm.
with grief.
Yeah.
It has been called in the past bereavement.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders,
Mm-hmm.
shortly called the DSM,
Mm-hmm.
it is in its fifth iteration
Okay.
in 2022, so 2 years ago. The text revision version, which you don't need to know all the details, but
Mm-hmm.
when they do the DSM, they produce, here it is, then they might do DSM number 2 or DSM 2R revised,
Mm-hmm.
DSM 3 TR text revision. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of its own unique language. My whole point, though, is in 2013, DSM 5 was published.
Mm-hmm.
In DSM 4 and previously, bereavement was considered almost like an exemption. the symptoms of bereavement or grief look a lot like depression.
Right.
They look a lot like maybe post-traumatic stress. They maybe look like separation anxiety, or they might be considered a severe adjustment disorder, because an adjustment disorder is by definition a response to a stressor or a stressing event or something like that. But in 2013, with the advent of DSM-5, they decided to include bereavement as a potential disorder.
Oh, interesting.
And that is a very interesting thing. And then in the
So they would think it was a disorder to be grieving someone.
but that's the whole point.
Okay.
We don't know. The mental health world is kind of not sure what to do with this thing called grief. Do we make it a normal thing because it's hard,
Yeah.
or do we normal to a point and then it becomes a pathology? And so, like in the DSM-5 TR 2 years ago, there is now an official diagnosis: prolonged grief disorder or complex bereavement. There's a couple different names for it. But here's the thing: the criteria that are used is very much similar to depression, because the idea is thought that, hey, you have this massive event, this massive loss that can trigger a depression. And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
But the linchpin, and I may be oversimplifying this, but the linchpin is if you are experiencing significant emotional distress, disruption of ordinary life functions, stuff like that, for more than a year, then this becomes potentially pathologized. And when it's pathologized, and you get funneled into, go see a counselor or go see about getting some medication or something like that. I don't know, and I would love to get your opinion because you have such expertise. Is that a good idea, or what do you think?
Well, I have a question. Do they have a time limit on postpartum depression or some of the other classifications within
They do.
depression?
They typically do.
So they're just trying to put it in a little box.
Well, with postpartum, you have a specific event, a birth has happened,
Right.
and within a certain amount of time, and I
You
don't
have
remember
so
the
many
specifics.
weeks
You got
to
so many,
get yourself together.
Chop. You got another 5 weeks, 4 weeks, but
Okay.
it is. I think postpartum is a 6 month.
Okay.
I think it might be longer than that, but yes,
Interesting.
there is.
I mean, it seems just as arbitrary as you have a year to get over this major loss. And it could be a major loss or a minor loss, or it could be a sudden loss. It could be that long
Right. But that
road.
doesn't. But just right there, your point. It does not take into account individual variation.
No.
So different people experience the same event differently.
Yeah. And time does not heal all wounds. Time is the context that God uses to heal wounds. And so you can't put a time limit on something like that, I think.
I think you're right.
And it comes in waves where you could be just walking along just fine. You walk into a room, or it's a day on a calendar or something like that, and there's just this fresh wave. And you think, wow, I was fine 2 seconds ago, and now I'm let me just get my feet underneath this. Everybody's just walking around normal, and it's like, whoop, give me just a second. Okay, we're gonna, and then, yeah, that might.
We like linear, step
Yeah.
by step, predictable things. You're familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's, back in the 1960s, she published a book called On Death and Dying, and she proposed there was a 5-stage model of grief. Now, if you read her, the 5 stages, she never said it's all linear.
And you have
go
3
from-
weeks to
right,
do each one.
There's none of that. It's not like 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to
Yeah.
5. She highlighted that it was, first, not linear,
Okay.
and secondly, it wasn't pathological.
Did she call it the stages of grief?
She did.
Okay, because the word stages sort of makes you feel like
Right.
it is linear in progression.
Right,
Okay.
right.
All right.
But she highlighted that because this was the model, it doesn't necessarily mean you go through each process in some stepwise fashion. But her 5 the 5 stages were denial, no, this is not happening, or it hasn't happened. Then anger, and when I'm saying then anger, yep, no.
Yeah.
You can have denial, and then you can have anger, and then you can go back to denial again.
Right.
And then you have bargaining,
Hmm.
which is if only, maybe if this, maybe if that. I'm trying to get my way out of this kind of a
Yeah.
situation, and
Hmm.
then I'm just gonna, it's not there, back to denial, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you have, and then the next thing in her stage model is depression.
Hmm.
And that's where the loss is really being absorbed and felt and metabolized. And I'm not even sure that that's the best word to use, metabolized,
It's a good word.
because but it sounds like it eventually goes away, and I don't know
No, but there
how
is a
that might
certain
work.
breaking it down and integrating into your system that word connotes. So
Okay. And then the
it's not a
last
bad
thing
word.
for her is, and it's like you just said, acceptance.
Hmm.
So, you start off with this, I can't believe it, it's not happening.
Yeah.
And then I'm powerless about it.
Hmm.
And there is anger, of course, and maybe there's a target, maybe it's kind of freely distributed, and that's hard
That's, yeah.
for everybody.
Yeah.
And then there's the bargaining, and sometimes a person who's doing that, especially if they're doing it out loud, other people are like, "Why are you thinking things like that?
Mm.
That's just totally unrealistic."
Yeah.
But it is part of the process a
Yeah.
person might need to go through.
I think that when there's a loss and the person left behind was, potentially in the same situation and didn't die, or maybe, that kind of thing. I think bargaining can be very specific to some situations. I don't know
I mean,
that
like
that would.
survivor's guilt.
Yeah, survivor's guilt. Hmm.
You see that a lot with military people and first
Yeah,
responders
and
and things like that.
how did that?
Mm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Kubler-Ross also said that it wasn't necessarily going to be the case that everybody would have
Oh.
all the five stages.
Hmm.
But again, the whole point is there's this model, and people are going to generally experience similar kinds of things over a course of time,
Hmm.
with the end goal or the hoped for outcome is an acceptance of, as you said, a new
Hmm.
normal.
Yeah.
And that new normal might be dramatically different than what the old normal
Yeah.
was. And
Yeah.
not
And not a
better.
preferred new
Right,
normal. It
exactly.
just is what's new.
Right.
And this is normal now. Hmm.
And again, it may be a new normal that is way worse, hard to adjust. I suppose it could be also positive, but that's probably a little bit less
Well, and that's
common.
where Christianity speaks to it, because there is, sometimes we don't see it in our lifetime, but God does make beauty out of ashes. Every time, again, sometimes we pass off the scene before we get to see the beauty that came from it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm.
even if the new normal isn't a preferred new normal, there are still beautiful things that can come from it and through it that would have never happened otherwise if the path hadn't been diverted. So I think that's where Christianity, it does sort of shed light differently on this. There is also the aspect of eternity. I mean, it is not permanent, as the secularists would like to think, that our loss is not permanent. There is a hope and a future, a new future that definitely involves
Mm-hmm.
the idea that that loved we will be reunited with that loved one at some point. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that
We're
is where we don't grieve as the world grieves.
right. We're having this conversation on Easter weekend, actually,
Yes.
and so it's kind of right there for
He
us.
is
We
risen.
have we have the horrific grief attached to the crucifixion of Jesus on Friday,
Mm-hmm.
and even the people who were with him weren't able to get it that this was what needed to happen.
No.
And then there he is on the cross.
And it's interesting because you see the apostles, some of them are in denial, some of them are angry, and
Right?
some of them, yeah,
Right?
it's interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is Friday, and then on Sunday, the miracle of the resurrection
Mm-hmm.
occurs. And like you said, if we hadn't had Friday, we couldn't have
Yep.
Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And life that is available because of Sunday would not have been available without Friday.
That loss.
So, but unfortunately for most of us humans, we aren't great at being able to go, well, I'm sure that this is going to be, just ducky soon. And I don't think we're even supposed to necessarily. We are we are asked to praise God at all times and receive whatever we receive from him with joy and thanksgiving. But that doesn't necessarily mean all of the emotions are just going to line up just
No.
like iron filings behind a magnet.
Yeah. And that is trusting that even though things are not, he doesn't call the things that happen to us good, but he will work them for good. And that's trust.
Yes. So, grief is this rather complex thing that doesn't seem to follow a prescribed timetable or a prescribed
Despite the DSM, right?
right, exactly. And so what we're really going to ask then is what is normal grief? What are the symptoms that you should expect if you are grieving? Even to the point like that's not there and it should be there. And is that a function of someone's denial? Is it something like that? But there will be some symptoms. There will be some sort of process that you go through, and what kind of a duration should normal grief, involve? Are there are there things that can be done that help a person move through, and then things that maybe don't help them move through, or in fact make it harder?
Right.
So I think those are questions that need to be looked at.
Right. And I think that different people do it differently. I do not think this is a one size fits all thing. I think that there are times where I have seen people walk into a situation and they say, wow, if one other person looks at me like, oh, you poor soul, they're not going to be able to handle it because they just, dusted themselves off, showered themselves, and they showed up. And they need that energy. And then there are times where if they walk into a room, same person, if they walk into that room and everybody's all cheery and roses and they're not feeling it, then they're going to lose it. So I think that's where communication becomes important, when you have someone close to you
Right.
and can say, how are you handling this, and where are you today? I had a hand signal with one of my friends where this was, don't look at me like I've just reached the end of the world and
Okay.
you want to cry with me. Actually, I need you to just smile and keep going.
Okay.
And this meant if one person acts like this hasn't happened and I should be normal, I'm going to lose it. So it was like, I would just look at her and she would go like this. And it's like, hey, how are you?
Now I know what to do.
Exactly.
Right.
And so I think that comes with that process of not being afraid to talk about it and just saying, oh, wow, I know we talk about it through the funeral. And so maybe there's like 3 weeks where it'll come up, but that person is still living day in and day out with it. And so you have to continue to say, hey, how we doing? Or, so, what are we doing?
Yeah. No,
Where
that's
are we
right.
today?
So there isn't a one size fits all kind of a approach to this.
No.
Actually, I think there are a number of things that impact how grief is metabolized. Personality. If you're an Eeyore type of person, you're going to be grieving differently than a Tigger person. And part of the difficulty with that is if the Tigger person sounds like Eeyore, oh no, what do we do with that?
Or if Tigger and Eeyore are married and they're sharing a loss. I mean, that's hard. I've seen
Yeah, that's
where
very good.
couples have a hard time grieving together because they're different and they're reacting to it differently.
And that's an excellent point, because what that highlights is how impactful a loss can be. I mean, what is typically held as the most severe blow that a person can have is the death of a child. And one of the things that we have a lot of awareness of from simply a research perspective is that couples who have a child die are much, much greater risk of divorcing because the weight that that loss brings into that relationship and into the larger context is simply so, so heavy that it can't be borne as long as it needs to be borne for them to be able to make it through.
And ironically, when you look at that rootlessness of grief, they need each other.
Yes.
They need each other very badly. And so the worst thing they can do is go their separate ways
Right.
to avoid any further pain. It's like, oh no, you're going to create more pain. Stay together and have some sort of rooting.
You had made a comment a little earlier and before we got here that men and women might grieve a little bit differently or process grieving a little bit differently. And that's coming to mind now because so a couple loses a child and that's tragic. And his solution, he goes to work and he's working overtime.
Yep.
And her solution is I need someone to talk to and he's not available. And so she's not available emotionally and their relationship starts to lose all of its air. Or worse, and I have seen this, affairs happen. Because that is one of the best distractions, not a healthy one, but one of the best distractions. I got this massive loss here that I have no ability to do anything about, so I will take my energy and attention into something new and exciting that helps me feel alive and distracted. Ooh, that's not a good recipe.
Which is probably why a lot of grief counselors warn against starting new things within the first year. I wonder if the year is from that manual, but just like let's not make any big decisions. Let's not, because we could just be hasty and looking for something new and looking for something to distract from doing the work of grief.
So different personalities, maybe some sex differences between men and women in terms of the typical way that they address dealing with grief. Another one I think is really, really powerful that we have lost are the family and societal scripts that are around loss. Historically, you might wear black for an extended period of time.
And they even had rules in society. It was for a year if it was a sudden loss, and it was half mourning was 6 months. If it was something where someone was, old and dying, or they had been sick for a long time, they would be in half mourning. And head to toe black. The men would wear armbands, and they would not be expected to attend society events, so that they didn't have to try to put on a brave face. They could just,
Ironic, though, there's a little bit of arbitrariness there too.
It is.
You can wear that for a year.
Exactly.
The thing about that I think is important is there is just this far-reaching permission. We do not expect you to be your regular self for a pretty good period of time.
And we're going to handle you with care.
And we will handle you with care. And then again, there are scripts and rituals. I mean, a funeral or a wake or in Hebrew culture, sitting Shiva. Or even, we laugh at this sometimes from our 21st century vantage point, but you hired mourners? You pay people to come and wail, because this thing has happened? Yes, because that's part of the community drawing together using an established script that does, in fact, help. It does help people move through this horrifically difficult experience. And in our culture today, let's do a memorial service. It'll be 3 months after the person's already passed. I mean, again, we're just talking about death. There are other things too. Shift for a second into divorce. It's only been in the last, I don't know, maybe 10, 15, 20 years, maybe, that Hallmark has developed cards for divorces.
Interesting.
Congratulations on your divorce. Oh, am I supposed to say congratulations? I'm sorry for your divorce. Because we're looking for some sort of a scripting to help us make sense of what we've gone through. And so for some people, if you're the leaver in a relationship, your emotional state might be considerably different than the leavee in the situation. So, but again, there's this need that we have. I think it's built into us to have a sense of community and support and connection with other people who give us the freedom to experience what we're experiencing. They don't have you should be better by now kind of a thing. So That I think is something that we've lost. And going back to the whole DSM thing, are we medicalizing or professionalizing what should be not medicalized so much?
I know, and is this just our culture's way of trying to clean things up? So it's not adultery, it's an affair. It's not, I mean,
Right?
it's alcoholism is not an addiction, it's an illness,
Hmm.
and so are we tidying this up?
There is an argument to be made that that might be
Yeah.
what's going on.
Hmm.
Hmm. We might want to talk about that in another conversation as
Yeah.
well. So there's also the question, and I've been asked this, and I have an opinion, and I would love to have your thoughts on this, but are there some losses or some griefs
Hmm.
you never get over?
I don't know, because define getting over it. I mean, getting over it is, in my mind, it's crafting a new normal and acceptance.
Yes.
And so, can someone just never craft a new normal and accept it? Is what I hear you saying. Is that what you're saying?
The way it's been asked of me
Okay.
has been, are there things you never get back to normal before that loss took place? Are there things that I'm always going to walk with that limp?
Yeah, and I think that's the definition of a loss is it's always going to be like that. You are always probably going to be aware of the loss, but I have seen some amazing stories of people who have, I mean, just tragedies.
Hmm.
And here we are 25, 30 years later because
Mm-hmm.
you walk the road with people,
Mm-hmm.
and to see how there is still a recognition of
Mm-hmm.
that loss
Mm-hmm.
and of that person. That
Mm-hmm.
person's missing,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm.
they have stayed together. They have really thrived instead of just survived through the loss. And so, is it a preferred new normal? No. And it's not new to them anymore. But I still think that goes back to the thing where God can make beauty out of ashes. I mean, He just takes the gnarliest of situations and really does somehow
Mm-hmm.
bring healing.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Yeah.
healing and wholeness that only you can get with Christ, I think, is part of that being kind of put back together. Is it on a timetable where it takes a year? Probably not. It probably takes longer
It
for
sure
some of
could.
those
Yeah.
losses. And so, won't they get classified as something according to that book? Yeah, probably. But there's still there's still growth and even sanctification that comes with
Mm-hmm.
relying and trusting on God through
Mm-hmm.
those losses.
I want to go back to something you said just a minute ago about thriving, not just surviving.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think really the question that is being asked, and just saying what you've said has helped clarify my thinking. Does this loss have to now define my identity?
Right.
Because there is identity disturbance in major losses.
Yeah.
But is a person who is going around 20 years later defining themselves as this person who went through this thing,
Yeah.
and I have 4 children, one of them is not in this world anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and so I have not been able to be, and I don't feel bad about it. I haven't been able to give the other 3 who remain,
Uh-huh.
because your sister was lost.
Uh-huh.
That I think is a concern that can show up.
Yeah, and I have known people who define themselves by that loss so much so that it becomes toxic to the other people who have suffered the same loss.
Talk about that. What do you mean?
And so that winds up then creating a situation where it's like the other sufferers of the loss say, wow, I can't be around. I can't be around that because that is how you're defining things. Everything is about how many days it's been since that loss. Whereas the other people in the family were trying to, like, okay, this is, let me try to get my brain around some acceptance on this. And so you've got one person living in it, wallowing, defining
Not
themselves by
wanting to
that,
move past it.
not accepting, just defining oneself by a loss. And that toxicity making it very difficult for the other people to grieve, accept, and carry on. I have seen that situation play out, and that is,
So does that maybe become a form of idolatry?
yeah. And it's almost like a grappling to redefine the person by who they are.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah.
And this is uncomfortable. I mean, to get at this level of depth, there may be some people who are listening who are really struggling to hear the possibility that in a sense they don't want to move past it. They have decided, even if they haven't consciously decided, they've decided to remain
And to
back in
define,
history and define
redefine
themselves
themselves.
going forward. It is the same kind of thing as a person who says, I'm a sexual abuse survivor. Well, when did that happen? 40 years ago. Is that all you can be? Is a sexual abuse survivor?
I think you're probably other things at that
I
point.
think you would hope, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not denying
No.
the seriousness, the significance of what happened in history.
And that's a loss. There's a loss of innocence there.
Oh, absolutely.
And so that's still adjusting to a new normal that is not a preferred normal, right?
Right.
I mean,
And going back to the idea of anger being empowering, that is one of the things that I've seen as a theme for people who don't seem to be able to move very far past the loss. There is an empowering identity forming anger sometimes.
and again, that's surviving. You can't flourish
Yes.
if your fuel cell is anger.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So maybe it is better to say that there will be some things that you may walk with a limp, but you'll still walk. And you might even be able to hobble and semi-run, metaphorically speaking,
Yeah.
and find that there is still life and meaning and purpose and good
Yeah.
after.
But you're also not expected to walk through this life and pretend that that limp doesn't exist. I think you need to have your people who are close to you where you can say, oof, man, I limped so bad I fell today. And so now I skinned my knees and, a touch point. You've got to have, I think, touch points along the way. And I think we need to be that person for other people sometimes to be able to wade into the uncomfortable. And I think that's important.
So let's talk a little bit about the person who has been hit with a massive loss. Maybe it is the death of a person. Maybe it's not the death of a person, but a death of a pet, the loss of a job, the loss of a home, the loss of a dream. Didn't get into law school. I don't know, something like that. But how does a person go through something like that and do the best for themselves that they can, given that you're stuck with it? It is now your reality, and there is no escaping it. You are now going to have to walk, crawl, slide, sit still, but get through it. What kinds of things does a person who has that given to them, what do they need to be doing?
I think that utter dependence on God, that is when a loss is outside of your control. I think that is a good reminder that we're not in control.
Yes, that's
and
true.
so how do you surrender that control without getting to know the one who is in charge of this world?
That can be hard because, again, anger and a target. God, you didn't have to do this, and
He can handle it.
It didn't make. He can.
He can.
That is
That's
true.
the thing, is that's probably the safest place to produce that anger and direct it.
I think one of the temptations that people have when they're undergoing the difficulty of a massive loss is they tend to want to isolate.
Yeah.
Don't want to talk to anybody, don't want to see anybody, don't want to do anything. And that's, of course, that sounds like depression. And it, yeah, it
Yeah.
is definitely in the same direction.
Yeah.
I think it's important that a person give themselves permission for some of that.
Yeah.
But it's also important, I think, to not just, metaphorically or literally go into your room, shut the door, draw the blinds, and,
Yeah.
you know,
And I think that's where it's important to have your people and to know where is a safe place I can process this and
yes,
not to be a drain, but
right.
to rely on those people and say, oh, I need this touch point real quick here.
That does highlight the importance of good relationships. And again, picking on our culture,
Yeah.
it's not hard to do.
Well, yeah.
We really are becoming quite adept at not really being connected to people.
Yeah.
We can be connected
Yeah.
online or in social media or superficial kinds of ways, but who really is there at 2 o'clock in the morning
Yeah.
when you are just at the bottom,
Yeah.
scraping by?
Yep. And that's life in community.
That is
And
life in
I would
community.
say if you didn't start there, to gain community after is an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And so, that community now, well, things all look like roses. Right. It's like, man, you've got to reach out and
that takes energy.
That. It does. It
and
takes
the person who's
intentionality
grieving
and
just
energy.
doesn't even feel like they've got energy.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they might even be like, who would want to be around me? I don't even want to be around me.
And that's where grief support groups are actually
Yes,
good.
right.
Because
That's
those
right.
people are willing to wade into whatever it is you're feeling because they're feeling it too.
Yep.
Or they've maybe been there and done that and are willing to lend
Right.
a hand to get you back up.
I think some other things that are important for a person who, I'll just call them a griever, someone who's grieving, don't isolate. Don't just muscle through though, just move on. I'm fine. It's good. And at the same time, in almost a paradoxical kind of way, don't stop living your life either. There are some things, even if you don't feel at all like doing them, that you should do, and maybe they're even in the have to do. I mean, there's leave that you could take from a job if you have a massive loss, but it would be important to remain attached to some kind of structure in one's life to the degree that that's possible. And I don't know where the balance is, but
it's sort of built in if you're really close to the loss because there's so much paperwork you have to plow through.
Well,
it's like, well, I can't just wallow. I've got these reams of data to process.
Yep. And if you think about a loss like a physical injury, and now you're in the hospital for 3 months, you're going to have to give yourself permission to accept that reality. And you might wish you could get out of your head, and sometimes that's good. Watch a movie, read a book, do something. But I think it's important to give yourself permission to take the time to feel the feelings that are there. Because they're not going to just go, oh, well, if you're not going to feel me, well, then I guess I'll just go away.
And that's where journaling really is good, because
Writing,
we're often thinking, oh, somebody's got to listen to this now. It's like, oh, no. You and a pen, you can get all those feels out and process them, because sometimes you can look at them objectively and go, oh, wow, well, oh, that's dark.
Yep.
I should, yeah.
And then you can also
or that's
review.
exaggerated or something like that. You can get a different view on it.
Right. And if you go back and read what you've written over the last 3 months, you can see, that's the same theme, and I'm not talking about that so much now. So there is some movement there. And again, I think it's incredibly important for people to not feel some sense of pressure that they're supposed to start here and get to here. You got only so many weeks or months or whatever it is, and it just needs to be thus and so. So I think that's an important part of the process. I think it's also important to try to find meaning. It's been said that, again, talking about death is the frame that gives meaning to our lives. What makes our lives significant? So those are hard questions. And again, if a person has not been in the habit of going there, that's going to feel really, really very foreign.
Right.
And included in that too is the acknowledgement of regrets, but also thankfulness for what was.
Yeah.
So again, if this all feels like it's a a conglomeration of contradictory things. That's kind of what grief
It's
is.
complex. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
Yeah. And I think our desire to stay away from painful topics is why we don't really live in light of the fact that grief could be a reality. And so we maybe don't keep short accounts or we don't say the things. It's like when I think when you've experienced grief and you understand, say, ramifications on the people left behind, I think it becomes important to make sure there are no regrets.
Yeah.
Everything that's needed to be said has been said. And so in the sudden losses, that can be harder. In those long lingering losses, there is a built-in mechanism to make sure are settling things. But I think if you were to live life in light of eternity and in light of the brevity of life,
True.
I
That's some
think you would
perspective.
always have, you wouldn't leave the things unsaid. You would make sure to, I end every phone call with "I love you." It's like, well, there you go, just in
But
case.
if you do find yourself in a situation where that hasn't been done,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's also key in this process is to get to a point of forgiveness,
Yep.
whether the forgiveness is of others or oneself.
Yeah. For not having said.
I wished I'd have said, or I wished I'd have done, and I kept putting it off, or whatever that was. There is going to have to be a point at which that is also released,
Yeah.
and otherwise, I think that's a part of what keeps people stuck
Yeah.
and not doing very well.
And that's probably part of the acceptance piece is
Yeah.
forgiving
Yeah.
yourself and the other person.
And that might even be, yeah, I wished I had done it differently, but I can't do anything about it now.
Exactly.
There may be at some level a need for social support, like a support group, or even maybe counseling, but I think there's a lot that can be done without some of that.
Yeah. Community is key.
Speaking of community, what if you are trying to be the support person or among the support community for a griever? What's important to do there?
Oh man, I still think that communicating where they are, where are you right now? And it could change maybe an hour from now,
Yeah.
but can I say, how are you doing? Or if I do, are you going to lose it? So, let me know where, just communicate.
Yeah.
Because I know it's complex and
Right.
I know it's going to change from day to day to day. And I think that is important. I think being willing to have those conversations of, I saw this today and it really made me think of
So
that
maybe
loss. And
maybe don't develop many expectations for what the griever is supposed to go through.
certainly not a timeline.
Yeah, no timeline.
And
Be
not an
there for a long haul.
expectation. It is a long haul. And
Right.
that's the thing. We're very good at that short term
Yep.
thing. But it's also important to say, oh, I remember that person's birthday is today. I should probably reach out and say, how you doing? Or it's been a year now. It's been 5 years now.
Seeking them out. Because sometimes in the immediacy of it, okay, we'll make food for you and we'll check in on you and
Casserole you.
Right. But 2 weeks later, when the meals aren't coming anymore,
Flowers
sometimes
have dripped off.
right, people are thinking you're fine now. Even but they're not thinking.
No.
But they've moved on to other things.
And isolated themselves from the pain of that person's
Right.
grief.
Because it's hard.
Yeah.
It is hard. And the person who's grieving sometimes feels like I am hard, and so why should people want to be around me?
Exactly.
And that compounds it.
Isolate you.
In the book of Job, Job goes through this horrific set of circumstances and loses everything.
Except for his wife.
Except for his wife. And you might even, if you read it, he might have been like, that would have been okay. But one of the things that's notable is he has these 3 friends who come and they sit with him for a week and say nothing.
Yeah.
In fact, they probably would have done better if they'd have just stayed there and not said anything. But they got into a conversation. But the point I'm trying to make is being present without any need to fix or explain or argue. I think that is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
But it's hard to do, especially when the grieving person gives themselves permission to go wherever. I hate God, for instance, or
Yeah.
God can't be good. Well, no, wait a minute. Maybe now is the time
Nope.
to just let that be.
Yep.
That's hard,
It is.
but the long haul,
Yeah.
and being present without a need to fix or something like that. I do think there is one thing that often is not thought about, and that is the possibility of danger signs.
Yeah.
The person who's grieving, sometimes they're subtle, like using a lot of alcohol. There's a lot of drinking going on,
Yeah.
and that's not such a great thing. I mean, I don't want to give them a hard time about it, but it's been 4 months or 6 months or however long, and there is a lot of alcohol, or worse. Sometimes suicidality becomes a possibility, and I think that's where being a support person means having your radar
Yep.
out and looking for those possibilities,
Exactly.
just in case,
Yep.
for safety's sake.
And I think even in the checking in with people, you can see those stages of grief play out, and so you can tell, are they bipping around? Are they stuck in the anger mode? Yeah.
Yeah. That's a tough one, to say the least.
Yeah.
And we're not in a world in our culture that really does very well with it. So thank you very much for your honesty about your own experience and your expertise that you have. And I hope that our listeners and viewers have gotten something of value from our conversation. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.